Okay, so my name is Tracy Ippolito, and I'm the coordinator of the Florida Brace program. Florida Brace, which is based on the CDC's Building Resilience Against Climate Effects framework, is working to improve the ability of the public health sector to respond to the health effects of climate variability. And we're doing this by incorporating the very best available science into routine public health practice. Today's webinar is the latest in a series hosted by Florida Brace, and it's my pleasure to introduce Bertram Melix as today's webinar presenter. Mr. Melix is a PhD student in the Florida State University's Geography Department. He received his master's in GIS. Today he's going to be discussing a research study which has been conducted under the guidance of Dr. Chris Waggio, an assistant professor of geography at FSU, and the principal investigator for Florida Brace. I won't go into too much detail except to say that the purpose of the study was to identify and evaluate how community-based risk factors contribute to differences in life expectancy rates across neighborhoods in Florida. Mr. Melix and Dr. Waggio's work sheds light on important differences between neighborhoods and ultimately residents who are experiencing health disparities within counties. For information, this webinar is being recorded, and we will post this to the Florida Brace website next week. And with that, I will turn it over to you.
All right, thank you for the introduction, Tracy. And hello, everyone. The title of this presentation is Florida Census Tract Analysis of Societal Determinants and Their Relationship to Life Expectancy Rates. Authors and collaborators on the research itself include me, Dr. Chris Waggio, Dr. Christina Kurtzinger, Dr. Kesha Reed, Chris Duclos, Melissa Jordan, Dr. Tisha Holmes, and Jesse Joyner. I'm excited to give this presentation today, and so we'll move on, and today I'll be discussing the societal determinants of health and their relationship to differences in life expectancy rates. So life expectancy differs throughout local communities in Florida. A large majority of the research we reviewed on life expectancy rates and the social determinants of health were conducted using county level data. However, at the county scale, important health differences between communities can go unnoticed. So this means that when examining life expectancy across counties, we may overlook important differences in health marked by residents of varying demographic, social, and economic status. So with the life expectancy and social vulnerability data sets that we're using in this research, we were able to identify and evaluate how community-based risk factors contribute to differences in life expectancy rates across neighborhoods in Florida. We were able to identify a few studies which examined life expectancy risk factors associated with race and income, but none included or controlled for the variety of risk factors at the sub-county or census tract level as were included in this analysis. So using census tracts, we were able to better describe neighborhood level or community health disparities. So we define census tracts as neighborhoods, as they're more precise and solely based within counties. And of the 4,214 census tracts in Florida, 3,680 were included in this analysis. Our goals for this research were as follows. We wanted to explore and evaluate how life expectancy rates vary spatially across census tracts in Florida. We also wanted to evaluate how the social determinants of health operate at the census tract level and contribute to the disparities we see in life expectancy rates. We also wanted to assess whether social vulnerability indicators can account for additional geographic variation in life expectancy beyond some of these broader components of the social determinants of health. And lastly, we wanted to unravel and interpret how social determinants of health operate interconnectedly and how they may act as proxies for other factors. On the next couple of slides, we'll be talking about data used for this research. Life expectancy was used as the dependent variable in this study. So life expectancy is a useful indicator for assessing health disparities in space. So the indicator is typically easily understood by the general public as well as by policymakers. Life expectancy reflects these place-specific causes of mortality. So this includes illnesses and major injuries, which are all embedded in these life expectancy calculations. So the estimates for life expectancy were calculated by Dr. Christina Kitzinger using mortality data from 2009 to 2013 and were provided at the census tract level for Florida. We ended up removing 534 census tracts from this analysis, and our exclusion criteria was as follows. Census tracts with small number of deaths, so less than 50 total deaths in that particular census tract were removed. Small populations, so less than 5,000 total population years, and unreliable estimates, so these are estimates with a standard error greater than 2 years. So this left us with the lowest reliable life expectancy estimate being 56 years and the highest being 93 years. Now we'll move on to discuss data for the social determinants of health. So differences in life expectancy rates between neighborhoods can in part be attributed to the social determinants of health. So when referring to these social determinants of health, these are the local conditions where people work, live, and age. So social determinants of health indicators typically focus on broad metrics such as income. These broader metrics likely capture multiple societal processes such as health insurance, education, and the healthy worker effect that produce disparities. So therefore, we drew upon the social vulnerability literature and the social vulnerability index to offer to inform our study. So just to offer a brief background on the social vulnerability index, it's a public health data set which details factors meant to indicate which individuals are at risk to be harmed by natural and or human caused disasters in Florida. So the data set, as I kind of alluded to, contains both broad and specific risk indicators. So we conducted an extensive literature review to identify factors included within the SOVI index with established links to health. So from the SOVI data set and our lit review, we were able to identify 26 life expectancy risk factors at the census tract level. We included 6 components of social determinants of health drawn from the social vulnerability literature in our analysis. These components represent various characteristics of local residents in Florida, such as race and ethnicity, socioeconomic status, housing status, household structure, gender, and retirement status. Each of these components have established links to health. So I want to highlight some of the more unique risk factors included in this analysis, and I'll start with access to an automobile, which is listed under the socioeconomic status component. So studies show car owners have better overall health than others. This is likely because access to an automobile can be critical for accessing and maintaining employment opportunities, healthcare services, as well as healthy foods. So factors indicating housing status, such as mobile homes, are known to impact health as well. So research shows mobile homes influence health through multiple social mechanisms, such as indoor housing risks. These can be from fire, injuries, toxins, unstable housing tenure, and the characteristics of the surrounding neighborhood. So negative health impacts are associated with living in a mobile home are as much shaped by geography as by potentially hazardous conditions present in the individual mobile home units themselves. So for the geographical aspect of this, mobile homes are typically located in suburban or rural areas and thus are further from employment opportunities, healthcare and services, healthy food options, and public utilities. So measures such as the percent of population living in an urban area and population density also capture this urban-rural difference in health outcomes. Indicators for household structure include percentage of families and age-dependent populations. These are also related to physical and mental health outcomes. So researchers have suggested that family or household structure is an important social group that is not commonly considered in social determinant of health research. So both family structure and household composition can have both positive and negative impacts on health. So for example, adult members in a stable family household experience emotional and physical health benefits emanating from shared resources, a sense of responsibility and meaning, as well as a social support network. So based on the literature review, we expect neighborhoods or census tracts with low unemployment, low poverty, and high education levels to have higher average life expectancy. So here I just want to provide information about the statistical technique we used and an overview of the specific statistical model. So the statistical model we use assumes that a particular census tract's life expectancy is related to local risk factors or its own social determinants of health, as well as to its neighbors' risk factors. So simply put here, the life expectancy in a particular neighborhood is related to the social, economic, and demographic conditions of itself and its adjacent or surrounding neighborhoods. So the statistical model we used estimated how likely a change in the value of a particular risk factor in the neighborhood would impact life expectancy in that neighborhood and for adjacent neighborhoods. Essentially, the technique reckons with the idea that the value of a variable or social determinant of health at one location, so in a given census tract, is related to the values of the same variable in neighboring locations or neighboring census tracts. So with the model we used, we can distinguish between local, direct impacts and neighbor impacts or indirect impacts. And researchers note these models account for spatially embedded social processes, these being the transfer and flow of goods, services, employment, and ideas between communities. So to test for spatial dependence, weights were constructed using the Queen's contiguity matrix. So this process accounts for spatial dependence and helps ensure that our estimates are reliable. So this weighting is defined by neighbors that share a border or edge with other tracts, and tracts are given a weight which is standardized so that the weights for a given tract sum to 1. So next I'll show an example kind of at a smaller scale, highlighting how the Queen's contiguity matrix works. So specifically, as I kind of mentioned, our statistical model estimated how likely a change in the value of a particular risk factor in a neighborhood would impact life expectancy in that neighborhood and for adjacent neighborhoods. So here's an example of the application of a process that I mentioned before, the Queen's contiguity matrix. And as I mentioned, this process is instituted to account for the flow of goods, services, and ideas between communities. So to explain how it's used here, the indirect or neighbor impacts to life expectancy, I will use this example from Gadsden County. So in this example, we can see that the indirect impact percentage of female-headed households in this case in Gadsden County would be calculated using the weight based on the number of neighbors or borders that a particular tract shares with other tracts. So the weights here are standardized so that based on the number of shared borders for a given tract, the weights will sum to 1. And in the bottom left corner of this map, the weighted sum of the shared borders is 0.2. This is because the tract shares 5 borders with other tracts. Essentially, this means that when the model calculates the neighbor, not local impact of female-headed households to life expectancy, it weighs the value based on the number of shared borders. So here, a weight of 0.2 would be applied to, let's say, 12.6%, and then evaluated against life expectancy in the surrounding tracts. This means that an increase or decrease in the proportion of female-headed households in this region affects only its 5 neighboring tracts because they are contiguous or immediate neighbors. And this follows the assumption that tracts that are near each other or more related than tracts that are further away. In relation to this study, a value of a particular risk factor or variable is related to the local and neighbor social determinant of health values. So ultimately here, we're interested in whether these factors are significant for predicting local life expectancy and life expectancy for adjacent tracts and neighborhoods. This image here just gives you an idea as to the reason behind the demonstration on the previous slide. So you can kind of see here that the connections or shared borders between census tracts in Florida are extensive. And the first inset map here shows Leon County and a portion of the surrounding counties. So as we can kind of see here, the model accounts for movement across county borders and between census tracts and neighborhoods. The second inset map here is highlighting the densely populated census tracts in the Tampa area. And for the third map, the inner city Miami is shown. And each of these representations is meant to give everyone kind of a sense of how the statistical model we use considers these so-called spatially embedded social processes. So I want to also emphasize that each of these tracts or neighbor impacts are only related to risk factors in adjacent tracts or neighborhoods. So only the tracts that share borders. And as we can kind of see here as well, tracts that were excluded were not included in the weighting process. So the models we used calculate local and neighbor impacts. This relates neighboring social determinant of health values to local life expectancy values. And as has been highlighted, these neighbor effects are confined to tracts that share borders. So the models provide direct and indirect impacts or coefficients for each of the social determinant of health factors in their relationship to life expectancy rates. So these values are coefficients, which we'll take a look at on the next slide. They describe the magnitude and direction, so positive or negative, to which each social determinant of health factor contributes to life expectancy. The model we use controls for the remaining spatial variation in life expectancy that's not explained by the variables included in our analysis. And this just allows us to be reasonably sure that our estimates are stable and reliable. And with the model fitness, what I'm trying to get at here is how well do our set of risk factors explain the differences in life expectancy between and across census tracts. So the R-squared value signals that around 70% of the variance in life expectancy rates for Florida is explained by the variables included in our statistical model. So here I'm just presenting the results in a table format. So just to get an idea of how to interpret these results, I'll point out a few important factors. So if we take a look at the results, we can expect that with a 1% increase in the proportion of Native Americans, we would expect to see on average a negative 0.24 years decline in the life expectancy rate. We also observe a 0.07 year increase in life expectancy rates across tracts that experience an increase in the proportion of persons earning or making more than $200,000 per year. So there are also significant negative impacts on life expectancy associated with educational attainment and access to an automobile. And I also want to note here that unemployment had negative local and neighbor impacts on life expectancy, while extraction jobs had positive local and neighbor impacts to life expectancy, which could kind of capture this, or which may capture this healthy worker effect. So as we can see here, percentage of female-headed households had a large negative local and neighbor impact on life expectancy rates. So based on this result, if you were to increase the percentage of female-headed households in a particular tract, we would expect to see a negative 0.15 year decline in life expectancy for each 1% increase in surrounding tracts. I also want to mention these housing status factors. So the magnitude and direction of the relationship of persons per unit, percentage of mobile homes, population density, and percentage urban to life expectancy rates. The amount of persons per unit in a neighboring census tract shows a benefit to the local census tract's life expectancy. And from here, I'll kind of move on to a discussion or interpretation of a few of these factors. So our results here, they shed light on some of the important risk factors that contribute to differences in life expectancy rates. Some of these underlying socioeconomic and demographic conditions present at the local level are shown to drive differences in life expectancy rates in this analysis. So for race and ethnicity, we found support for the Hispanic paradox. So our results from the model show that a positive relationship between the Hispanic population and a 0.07 years increase in life expectancy rates exists. And essentially this Hispanic paradox just refers to Hispanic communities having lower socioeconomic status, but relatively higher life expectancy. So support for the Hispanic paradox here may be related to long-term benefits of educational attainment and the types of Hispanic groups living in Florida. So for example, within the Cuban population, women are 2 times less likely to die in the 45 to 64 year age range compared to non-Hispanic white women. And it's also worth noting that a higher proportion of immigrants from Central and South America in the 1980s were from a middle-class background and had a relatively higher educational attainment. So the proportion of Hispanic population also was the most important factor in our statistical model for explaining differences in life expectancy between communities. We also note the percentage of population who identify as Native American had the largest measured impact amongst our racial or ethnic variables. So multiple research studies kind of conclude that Native Americans experience the lowest life expectancy rates of any racial or ethnic group. Also, wealth was important. So proportion of persons with less than a high school education was associated with both a negative local and neighbor impact to life expectancy. And it can be said this kind of reflects socioeconomic status and in a way may be acting as a proxy for poverty. And it's also should be mentioned here that poverty in our model had no significant relationship to life expectancy, but it's likely that this factor and others are accounting for that relationship, so they may be acting as proxies. Persons who earned over $200,000 also had a significant positive relationship to life expectancy, and drivers of this trend may be explained by this group's political and social capital and the differences in education. Rural and urban differences were also important. So tracts with larger population densities, which are more likely to be urban, were predictive of longer life expectancies. And this relationship likely accounts for the insignificant local impact of urban areas. So while urban areas had no significant local relationship to life expectancy, significant negative neighbor impact was measured of a negative decline of 0.01 years to life expectancy was observed. So the relationship between life expectancy and urban tracts may reflect combined impacts of risks in urban areas, as well as benefits to healthcare from proximity. The indirect impact has a significant negative relationship to life expectancy rates, and this may be caused by mitigating access to healthcare and providers for rural residents. So population density significance may act as a proxy for our urban variable, and there is a positive relationship between population density and life expectancy rates. So it may be the case that in more densely populated rural areas, which are likelier to be more near to these urban centers or urban tracts, residents experience better health outcomes. So proximity to urban tracts may mitigate access to healthcare and providers for rural residents. And it should be noted here that these benefits may only be experienced by rural residents of higher socioeconomic status. And this is kind of reflected in the negative association between percentage of mobile homes and life expectancy rates. So for housing status, persons per household had a negative local impact and positive neighbor impact. This kind of contrasting negative local and positive neighbor impact for person per household on life expectancy may reflect some interesting geographic dynamics. So locally, more persons per household may capture another dimension of poverty, which decreases life expectancy. So the persons per household spillover effect may point to different processes in urban versus rural context. So in metropolitan areas, the local persons per unit penalty is canceled out by the benefit from proximity to resources and healthcare services. For household structure, both percentage of age-dependent populations and percentage of families had positive impacts on life expectancy. So family structure factors did have contrasting local and neighbor impacts. So single parent and two-parent households were differentiated in this analysis as well. And this was through the local and spatially measured impacts of proportion of families, proportion of age-dependent populations, and proportion of female-headed households. So for gender, female-headed households had a large negative local and neighbor impact on life expectancy. And this could possibly stem from female-headed households having, or who are more likely to have, limited economic means, and it could also be related to missing out on the benefits to physical and mental health of cohabitating with a partner. The most important or actionable factors that we identified through this research was female-headed households, mobile homes, and access to an automobile. So in the statistical model, these factors explain a relatively large portion of the differences in life expectancy. It can be said instituting support programs for female-headed households may be an important means for addressing life expectancy disparities. Also, mobile homes explained a significant portion of differences in life expectancy. So targeting interventions near communities where mobile homes are present may be able to alleviate some of these disparities. And then access to an automobile, so considering innovative policies such as vouchers for ride sharing, which could help ensure people lacking access to an automobile are able to maintain a reliable means of transportation for their regular healthcare visits and services, may also be a means of addressing health disparities. So to kind of tie all this together in our research, considering social vulnerability indicators in addition to some of the broader social determinant of health metrics allow us to more accurately characterize and investigate spatial health disparities. This framework can be used kind of to investigate geographic disparities in health outcomes through kind of a social determinant of health approach at the local level. So the factors outlined, they explained a large portion of the variation in life expectancy rates between neighborhoods in Florida. And this kind of provides evidence for using social vulnerability indicators in investigations of health disparities at the neighborhood level. So identifying these important risk factors for life expectancy can play a role in improving public health strategies and targeting health interventions to reduce local health disparities. So these next two slides will just give you a visual example of what can also be done with the results from our model. So the map here shows the predicted trend of life expectancy rates in each census tract in the Tallahassee area. So the life expectancy estimate and trend estimate here are different. So however, some areas life expectancy estimates here may already be below average. This is kind of highlighting a trend in the life expectancy rate based on the social determinant of health factors in that census tract's composition. So the trend estimate here kind of shows that social determinant of health factors result in disparities in life expectancy. And if we took a look at some of the social determinant of health data within the outer tracts, so in the south and western portions of Leon County, they tend to have a higher percentage of mobile homes and lower per capita income. Some other noticeable factors there also include lack of access to an automobile. So this example shows census tracts from Boca Raton to Miami. So what's being highlighted here is the kind of interesting relationship between the Hispanic population and the increase in predicted life expectancy rates. So this just supports the Hispanic paradox that I had kind of mentioned earlier. And I did want to note one last time here that the percentage of the Hispanic population was the most important factor for explaining differences in life expectancy in our statistical model. All right, and so thank you for taking your time out of your Friday to view the presentation. And I wanted to ask if there were any questions.
Well, we have one question that the person must be having audio difficulties, so they sent it via chat. Their question was, are there limitations with this model or this research in translating to other localities that have high vulnerability in populations?
Limitations with this model. I did take a look at kind of the residual spatial autocorrelation here, and there wasn't any significant left. So I think the model did pretty well in capturing the magnitude and kind of direction of these factors in relation to life expectancy. As for the vulnerability, the SOVI index I do think is kind of a good tool for assessing some of these spatial health disparities and including more specific risk factors. So yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? The good news is your email address is on the last slide, as I can see. As I mentioned at the beginning of your talk, and thank you very much for the talk. This was excellent. We are recording this, and so the talk will be placed on the Florida Brace website early next week. Going to wait a minute or two and see if anyone else has something to say before we bid adieu. Okay. Well, thank you again, Bert. I appreciate your time and your excellent preparation. Please let me know if you do hear from anybody as a result of this. And I will get the recording up there early next week.
Okay, great. Yeah, and thank you again for organizing this, Tracy. I really do appreciate it, and I'm glad I had the opportunity to present this research.
Excellent. All right, thank you so much.
All right, thank you. Y'all have a good one.
Bye-bye.